Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Python Code Bytes. This is the third episode, and this week we're going to be looking at something called types in Python. Now, we've looked already at how we can write some basic code, and we've also had a little look at something called a variable, a way of storing information. This week, we're going to be looking at how the computer understands what the information stored is. A good way I like to talk about this with my students is I always talk about the idea of shapes. And the reason I do this is very simple. Basically, with shapes, you've got different types. We could, for example, have a square. And we could also have a circle. Let's get this so it's just not quite touching the square. There we are. Right? So, imagine that we have a collision detection system that's been set up. And I have two types of object. I have a square and a circle, and both of these are defined in the code as shapes. So the computer knows that they're both shapes, but it knows that this is a certain type of shape, and it knows that this is a certain type of shape. And basically, we're going to be moving this circle in this direction. So we're going to be moving this circle up here, okay? We're going to do that frame by frame in a game. So at one point, the circle might be drawn here, and then the next it'll be drawn here. And basically, what we're going to do is we're going to be checking for collisions between this circle and this square. Now, the computer knows that this circle and this square are circles and squares, so it can do a collision detection for a circle against a square. But what happens if it doesn't know that the circle is a circle and the square is a square, and it just tries to do a square against a square? So let's draw a square around this circle, and you can see that now the code, if we were thinking of this circle as a square in terms of our collision detection, it's as if it is actually collided with the square, even though we know visually it hasn't. So what we need to do is we need a way of explaining to the computer that, well, this is a square, this is a circle, and that they work differently. And that's done with something called types. So let's get over to our code editor. I'm going to create a new file, and we're just going to save this as in our teaching folder. Let's go to tutorials, Python, it's in code bytes, and let's save this as types.py. Okay, so now I have a new Python file, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new variable called x, and I'm going to set the value of x to 3. Okay, and now I'm going to create a new variable called y, and I'm going to set the value of y to 4. There's a difference between these two, and we're going to discuss just what these quotation marks mean in a minute. But now, all I'm going to do is I'm going to say print x plus y, and we're going to run it. And we've got something here, an error. Well, why am I getting an error if I'm adding two numbers together? Well, the reason is these quotation marks here, I mentioned in the first week, something called a string literal. And what these quotation marks mean is that whatever inside of them is going to be a string. So notice here, a string is a collection of letters, numbers, punctuation, whatever. Basically, words. That's what a string means. An int stands for an integer. That's any number. So any just number that we can look at. So 3 would be an integer, 4 would be an integer. An integer has to be a whole number, so 3.1 wouldn't be an integer. 3.1 would have to be a something called a real type, which would be a double or something along those lines, maybe a float. Basically, if I want to be able to add 3 and 4 together, the computer can't do that because it's trying to add. Even though this is a number, we can see this is a number, the computer thinks it's a string, a letter, a collection of letters and numbers. So if we remove those quotation marks and run the same code, you can notice it's adding 3 and 4 together. Well, what happens if I put quotation marks around both of them? Now they're both strings, but can we add strings together? Well, in fact, Python does know a way of doing that, and all it will do is it'll add take the first one, and it will literally add the second one onto it. So notice, even though this is a 3 and this is a 4, we haven't added them together as a number, we've just plonked one on the back of the other one. So, we now have a way of telling the computer what type of information we're going to be receiving. But say I do have a 4 like this, in quotation marks, When I run this, I'm going to get that error again. Unsupported operand types. We can't add an integer and a string together. So what am I going to have to do? Well, I can use this little function here. This is called just int. Notice how this is the same as here. And I'm passing in a string, because our second variable is a string. So I'm passing a string into this int function, and it's going to try and just convert that into an integer. And there we go. It's done it absolutely fine. Now what happens if I call this an a? Well, invalid literal for int with base 10a. Basically what this means is we've tried to pass something into a function that converts the string to an integer, but it's not an integer. This a cannot become an integer, so it's just thrown an error for us. What happens if we want to do this the other way around then? What happens if I want to add the number 3 to the letter a, but instead of converting the letter a to an integer, I'm going to convert my number 3 into a string? Well, let's just pass that x into our string function, and I have two strings together, and now it can add them together. So that's just a very quick introduction to types and what they mean. We will be going a lot deeper into this in future weeks, but that's just a great starter activity to give you a bit of an idea of how computers understand what information is. I'll see you next time for another episode of Code Bytes.